All right, as they're heading out, let's go ahead and turn in our Bible to Revelation chapter 17. Remember, Brother Chris Llewellyn is getting to preach over there where Joey started tonight. So remember Brother Chris in your prayer. And I believe Brother John Melton and his family went over there. He said scotch for him. So that's where they're at. But I'm glad he's excited about that. He's asked you all to pray about that. Revelation chapter 17, and we're also going to be in the book of James tonight, James chapter 4. And I'm going to be brief as possible as I can. I don't run with a lot of things here. There's a lot of room that if I run some of these rabbit trails, the message could really take a while. So I'm purposely going to try to stick with what I prayed about, what I prepared for, and not do too much straying off here. But the subject I want to preach on tonight is on troubled waters. Troubled waters, and I'm preaching about the nature of men and really the problem of strife in the world. And it doesn't have to be reduced to just the world. It could be your home, could be the relationships you have on the job. But people are likened to waters. You'll notice here in Revelation chapter 17, look at verse 1. Revelation 17 verse 1 says, and there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. And you see there, she's sitting upon, we would say maybe presiding over many waters. And it says, look down there, verse 15, these waters are identified for us as exactly what this means. There's no reason to try to input our own opinion. It says in verse 15, He saith unto me, The waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples, and multitudes, and nations, and tongues. All right, so go ahead and get James chapter 4 then. James chapter 4, we'll be there in just a minute. But the population, it's likened to many waters, and as such, people, they tend to slosh back and forth about issues and tend to get troubled a lot. The book of Jude speaks of some folks as being raging waves, which are coming in and crashing against the shores, and they're foaming out their shame. Psalm 65 speaks of the noise of the seas and the noise of many waters there, the waves being like, quote, the tumult of the people. Jacob, speaking of the consistency, or the inconsistency rather, of Reuben, likens him to water, and makes the statement, says, unstable is he. So we think of people, we think, well, they're very unpredictable. And that's really not true. They're not consistent, okay? So that's untelling when it comes to people. But they are predictable. You can predict. You can't count on people. Amen. And the character is like water. It just splashes here and there, back and forth. You think about us, just the natural state. Our actions, reactions, always water takes the path of least resistance, always going downhill. And when you have these waves that are coming in, that's a movement of a bunch of water. And that's like I was preaching Sunday here, talking about these movements that happen within peoples. These movements are never anything good there. It's happening not only around the world, it's happening in our nation. And people have their problems, and we could say people are their own problem. And it's the same everywhere. People create problems for other people, and people create their own problems, but somehow or another, we've noticed people like to blame the Lord for all the problems there are in the world. And the Bible, when we study it, lays the blame right where it belongs. It's at the feet of people. And tonight, we're just going to be one of those messages. It's a little different, I'll admit to you, right at the start here. But I'm just going to address the confusion and the strife that's really divided up our nation. It's a burden to me, and I know some folks, when I talk to them there and about, they're concerned what's happening, what's taking place in our country. And I just want to remind you tonight as to what the root reason for all this bitterness and all this contention is. It's not a new thing. Some would say the problem in America is a racial issue. And I would agree to that somewhat there, not from the angle that they would claim. It's not a one-sided explain-all solution. Racism really, as troubling a part of our nation's history as it is to most people, it's not representative of what's happening today, in the culture that we're in, unless we're talking about the weaponization of the terms of racist and bigot being thrown to accuse people who do not believe they're racist or bigots. And you might have heard, just recently, the training that Coca-Cola is trying to implement, instituting towards their employees. The reason they're doing this is because of the fear of litigation. Fear of litigation, of course, is causing a lot of people to do some things they shouldn't be doing, keeping some people from doing what they ought to be doing. But the fact is that they have implemented this training towards, quote, being less white. And if you're wondering what that means for their employees, being less white, the courses are outlined online. You can look it up. And it means this. It means being less oppressive, less arrogant, less certain, less defensive, less ignorant, more humble, learning to listen, believing others, breaking with apathy, and breaking with white solidarity. Now, that's an official course that's going to be implemented for Coca-Cola employees about being less white. And what it shows you is what they think about white folks right there, what it means to be white. It means that you're oppressive, arrogant, certain, you're defensive, you're ignorant, you're proud, you never listen, you won't believe others, and you're apathetic towards racial issues, and you're all caught up in this because you're all white. Now, again, this is what's taking place. It's even been implemented into the schools now with the new president. He's going to make sure that this gets into the curriculum where kids are being trained to be less white. And again, this is all to oppose racism and bigotry. Does anyone else see the irony in that? How crazy it is. Now, the issue of slavery from well over 100 years ago has been misrepresented. And it would not take 20 minutes of investigation to realize slavery isn't even a white and black issue. I'm talking about literally. It's not about white people enslaving black folks. Slavery is nearly as old as man. It goes back over 5,000 years nearly, and it's not isolated either to American history. America is barely over 240 years old, and slavery goes way back a lot farther than that. And most of the time, it was people of the same color enslaving one another. And as you read about it in the Bible, it's about indentured service a lot of times in the context, someone trying to pay off a debt. But it's absolutely not a white and black matter, even though it is certainly a part of this nation's history. And anyone that couches it as if it's only peculiar to this nation, anyone that does that and tries to further that point, they have an agenda, and you shouldn't listen to them seriously because either they're in over their heads and they haven't spent 20 minutes researching the subject, and they're trying to misrepresent what actually is true. One or the other. They don't know what they're talking about, or they're trying to mislead people. And either way, you shouldn't listen to them. Now, that's not to justify all the proven abuses that took place in our American history, but trying to correct those things from way back then by afflicting people today and also stirring people up in an evil way today. That's an insane proposal. That doesn't make any sense at all. And in other words, you can't punish people today who are not guilty of slavery abuses from way back then, and people today shouldn't get stirred up over abuses that took place, especially that they never suffered. They never suffered such injustices. Yet somehow we've got a culture in this nation where that's what is going on. That's what's being taught, and there's white folks today in America that feel guilty just over being white. And you have black folks that are enraged about being black, and they're enraged about the injustices of slavery, and they never suffered those injustices. And anybody with whatever color skin you have can look back on the abuses of that system and be against it. You don't have to be white or black, amen, but that's the temperature of the culture. And for someone like me to say that you are falsely accusing me of racism or bigotry to those that would do such is only proof to them that I am a racist and a bigot. That's the kind of training they're being subjected to. Now, that's how confusing all this is. If you say, well, I'm not a bigot, I'm not a racist, they say, well, you must be. Or you wouldn't say that. You see, you're being too defensive. You're being too arrogant. You're not listening. You're being too white. And that's the training that's taking place. And this stuff's even being preached in church pulpits in America today. And it's straight departure, not only from biblical truth, because anybody reading the Bible realizes it doesn't address these kind of social issues there, but it's also a departure from reality, meaning you're in la-la land. You're not even dealing with reality. You're in a dream state of idealism. And racism at its best, or I should say at its worst, it's only a symptom of what's really wrong in our country, what's really tearing our nation apart, and really what's been dividing up nations throughout human history. And the effort to combat all this is fueled, of course, by the spirit of bringing everything together. You want to correct the injustices of racism, and of course, upon you and I knowing what the problem is there, we understand there's only one solution to this kind of problem. And it's not us. We're not going to fix, the world cannot fix the problems of the world. It won't happen. And you know, this tear in the seam of the fabric of American society, I believe, has started. And you may not agree with me, but in my opinion, I think it's going to go. I think it's going to go. I think we're going on a dangerous time. And the problem, you know, for some, they think, well, it's politics, but it's not just politics. It's not just conservative thought versus liberal thought in politics. Admittedly, that is a quite big divide throughout the history of our nation. I mean, it started off once with Jefferson, his thought about the way government should be set up, versus Hamilton and the way he thought it should be set up. And you got Washington and John Adams in the middle of that, trying to straddle that situation. And the thought was about big federal government theory as opposed to strong state governments united to form a federal government. And so the angle really was, I mean, to just kind of paraphrase, is it America with all of her states, or is it really the United States of America? And it was two opposing views as to how the government ought to be set up and which group should have the stronger side. And it was a real terrible debate until it all played out on a battlefield. And that's where it led one side of this country fighting the other side of this country. That's what took place. Some say, well, it's North versus the South. Some say, is the Civil War. Many on this side were taught that it was the war against Northern aggression. When I was in Texas, I remember hearing about the war between the states. Now it's just being taught as the war against slavery. And that's just ignoring so much about what the war was actually about. But in a lot of ways, it really was. It was liberal big government against strong state government. And one side professing that it was fighting for states' rights, and the other side professing that it was fighting to preserve the Union. And that's how it was couched. That's how it was phrased as far as what the war was about by the people that were in Congress at that time and by the sitting president of the United States at that time. That's what they said the war was about, all right? By 63, 2 years into it, of course, the tune changes, and now it's just been rewritten, by the winners. The winners get to write the history, and they can tell even the folks down here what you were actually fighting about and what they were actually fighting to end. And really it comes down to big federal government against state independence or state freedoms. Now, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I feel like once the narrative became that the Civil War, so to speak, was just about ending slavery, and that's the way it's taught in school. Once that became the narrative, then I believe you opened the door to demean the entire history of this nation. And so it's all up in the air because of the way they wanted to paint the South as a bunch of racists, because in the minds of the college student today, well, if Robert E. Lee is a racist and his monument's got to come down, then George Washington is a racist and his monument's got to come down. And that's the way they think because, George Washington owned slaves. And so did many of the founding fathers and the framers of the Constitution. And therefore they demonize the very Constitution that's supposed to govern this land. And it doesn't matter, we sitting here tonight, doesn't matter how we line up with these two opposing sides as far as that war that took place so long ago, North versus South, given that there was a winner. on the battlefield. And there was a loser. And there were 620,000 Americans killed by the end. And the outcome was just horrific. And long after that terrible war that took place, with all the hardship that it brought on this country, north and especially in the South, the debate still rages on about government. And it's perched now as liberalism versus conservatism. It's big government versus small government. And our government in this nation, and this is I think proper for people to understand, is supposed to be a republic. That's what when we talk about standing up for the flag. When you stood up and you pledged allegiance to the flag, you were pledging allegiance to the republic for which it stands. All right? So we're a republic, and there is therefore supposed to be representation from duly elected officials governing by principle and conviction according to the will of the people who elected them. And the great document in the land that rules, is supposed to be the law, is the Constitution with all of its Bill of Rights. And the spirit behind this ruling document was and is to limit government and to protect the citizens of this nation from its own government. Because the framers of the Constitution understood the nature of men, and especially when it comes to men in power. The old saying was, power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. You say, do you believe that, Brother Dilbert? No, because men are corrupt before they ever got in power. And so that's the problem with all government, with all human government. You're not going to find one that fixes everything. There's always going to be something that you can pick at, and something you can cry about, and something you can whine about and complain about, because the people in charge are sinners like you are. And that there's no different in them. Now, that brings up the real problem then as to what's going on, what's tearing up this nation. It is the nature of men. It's the nature of all men. Notice here in James chapter 4, the first verse, he says, "From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence? Even of your lust that war in your members?" And of course, the following verses pertain to prayer, the need of humility, danger of pride, the importance of separation, distinction from the world in a sense of being loyal to the Lord. And so those things are so important. They get our full attention after we leave the first verse. Usually only use the first verse to set up and establish those truths that follow. But that first verse, it establishes a truth for itself, all by itself. And even though it asks a question, and that statement that it makes, the truth that it establishes, is reinforced down there in verse 5. Look down there, verse 5. "Do ye think that the Scripture saith in vain, the Spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy?" And again, the truth revealed here is about the nature of men. Why can't people get along? What are they fighting about? All these kind of things. It's the nature of men. That's the problem for all the strife, all the contention, all that confusion that's taking place, things pulling at the threads of the fabric of our nation, literally tearing us apart. But again, as I said, it's nothing new, and the problems on every side of the aisle, all sides of the issue, whether it's right or left, black or white, north or south, is the sinful nature of men. That's the problem. And as he put it, the spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy. We're also told that which he's referring to as the flesh, and it lusteth against the Spirit of God. Now, let me talk to you a little bit tonight about George Orwell, born in 1903, 1905, died in 1950. Okay, that's off the top of my head. If I'm wrong, I'm not meaning to lie to you. But he is presented to us today, and especially those that go on to school, as the closest thing to a prophet that atheism ever produced. This guy knew something about society. He knew something about social issues. He knew something about human government. And his was a pen name for Eric Arthur Blair. And he wrote the famous classics of 1984 and The Animal Farm. And he also wrote a book review that I want to talk to you about tonight about Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler's book on Mein Kampf. Now, Orwell, he voiced and took his stand against totalitarianism, which is just a subservience to the state. For example, a dictatorship. And he described himself as a democratic socialist. And I got to thinking about him tonight because we're hearing more and more that term. Those who want to distinguish themselves as democratic socialist, and they want to separate themselves from what is called just a socialist. And it's funny, you look it up, you'll find out that the socialist wants to distinguish themselves. Make sure you understand the distinction between them and communist. And then the communist wants to make sure you understand the difference between them and fascism or a dictatorship. Remember, just to give some light, there at World War II, you had the Nationalistic Socialist Party, the Nazis, going to war against Stalin's militarized communism there. Even before America ever entered into World War II, that was taking place. The Nazis fighting communists about the way men are going to rule over men. And that's what was taking place. And it's a misdirection. It's a common misunderstanding for men to try to brand communism or socialism and liberalism as being far left, and then talk about those who are conservative as being far right. They'll talk about the far right Nazis, that's the way they'll talk about it. And that's a deceptive smokescreen, because on that scale that they've created there, you're talking about a scale of government. The far right, the far left, would be big government on one side as opposed to small or no government on the other side. And of course, that would mean that the far right would be anarchist. They wouldn't believe in government at all. They would despise government altogether. And the far left would be just about everything else. The Nazi, fascist, the dictatorships, the communist, socialist, democratic socialist, you name it. And here's the thing, as Bible-believing Christians, the position that we should take as Bible-believing people is that no matter what government we find ourselves in, what country we're in, we're to obey the government, we're to submit to the ordinances of men, and we're to pray for those that are in authority. But here's the problem. We're Americans. Amen. And as American Bible-believing Christians, we, of course, understand the more freedoms we have, the better. So a democratic republic has served us to this point as a great system of government because it's just kind of out of the way, or it's supposed to be out of the way. And we're supposed to be protected against our own government. And so I pray it'll continue to be that way, that it will not just completely fold and develop into a full socialist style of government like it's trending to become. The reason things are trending in that direction, you understand, are from voiced or perceived injustices, cries of mercy, cries of folks in need, folks that are in a state of misery, and that there's some abuses that are taking place in their life, or there's some problems they're dealing with. And government, of course, they're going to say is going to try to correct those problems, especially if there's enough people crying about it. If there's enough people whining about it, they're going to try to get involved, and then people won't care that government got so involved and took and assumed all that control, all that power, because after all, they're trying to do right. They're trying to correct these, quote, injustices. They're trying to reverse these kinds of sufferings. But that movement, that we can say that wave coming in, creating all that foam of shame, is going to be detrimental to our peace as Christians in this country. Eventually, our liberties are at stake. They are. And not so much right now, but as the time comes, it is leaning that way. And it's obviously going to be detrimental to our freedoms as Americans, period. And that's the trend things are going in. Now, these democratic socialists who wear the badge, they think with honor, are claiming to be do-gooders. These are do-gooders, and they believe they're problem solvers. They're the ones with the compassion. And of course, maybe many of them are. Maybe some of them are. I'll say it that way. But by far and away, most of them are just idealists. And they may want to do good, but in many cases, they're overcorrecting in situations where there are only imagined problems. Given the amount of whiners and complainers that we have in this nation, you understand it's almost a full-time job for many people in this nation to do nothing but sit in front of a keyboard and a computer screen and just fake outrage all day long. And that's a culture in this nation right now, and there's folks listening to them. There's folks listening to these kind of people that do nothing but stare at a computer screen and just complain and whine about the way things are. And ultimately, you know, you have these groups that are failing to realize the great reality. Oh, we're trying to do good. We're trying to help people. And the fact is that people cause their own problems, and people create problems for other people because people are the problem. And so a lot of these things that they're trying to correct aren't going to be corrected by government, that's for sure. You know, you're going to try to correct the weather. You're going to try to correct climate and all that kind of stuff. Well, I'm afraid we're not God. We're not going to be able to do that, you understand? Now, the problem with any and all human government is the nature of men. That's it. And before George Orwell wrote those works that he's known for, he wrote books and essays that most people never heard of. And one of them, he gives a review. He gives a book review of Mein Kampf. That is Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. And in this review, he explains some things that I think most people are pretty confused with. Like, for example, I mean, you go back to that era in time, and it doesn't make any sense that this nation of physicists and operas, the land of Germany, would embrace Hitler. He would rise. He wasn't so popular at first, but he rose to popularity and power. And the question is, of course, is how did this, quote, enlightened nation embrace a leader like that? How did that man get to that place? And Orwell explains it by drawing attention to peculiar facts about human nature that for some reason most people still overlook. And what's interesting is that these overlooked facts about human nature can help us understand what the problem is in America today. America is the most powerful, the most prosperous nation that there's ever been. And that's a fact. And yet what we've been seeing for months now is that there are many Americans that would just like to burn this place to the ground. They hate this nation. And they're Americans. Now why? Why is that? Well, here's Orwell's opinion. I'm going to do some reading for you, okay? He says, well, I didn't come to church to be read to. Well, tough. I'm going to read to you tonight. And here's what he said. He says, quote, it's a sign of the speed at which events are moving that Hearst and Blackett's unexpurgated edition of Mein Kampf, published only a year ago, is now edited from a pro-Hitler angle. Now, what he's talking about is Hearst and Blackett are a British publishing company that put out what he called an unexpurgated copy of Mein Kampf, meaning it didn't cut out the offensive parts, such as all the racist remarks and all, and it had a spin towards Hitler. And it's all changed. He says, quote, the obvious intention of the translator's preface and notes is to tone down the book's ferocity and present Hitler in as kindly a light as possible. For at that date, Hitler was still respectable. He had crushed the German labor movement, and for that, the property-owning classes were willing to forgive him almost anything. Both left and right concurred in the very shallow notion that National Socialism was merely a version of conservatism. Now again, keep in mind, this is a review written in 1940, and World War II began in September of 1939, and before that, Hitler was still respected even in Great Britain. So much so that the British had published this edition of Mein Kampf to cast Hitler in a favorable light. And the publication gives it their spin of all this. And here's Orwell saying, you know, isn't it amazing that the British, just a year ago, were trying to defend this guy? That's his question. He says, quote, then suddenly it turned out that Hitler was not respectable after all. Well, that's the understatement of the 20th century. He says, as one result of this, Hearst and Blackett's edition was reissued in a new jacket explaining that all profits would be devoted to the Red Cross. What's that? That's their penance. They're not going to benefit from this book they put out because they didn't tell the truth about Hitler when they were reviewing it. But he says, nevertheless, simply on the internal evidence of Mein Kampf, it is difficult to believe that any real change has taken place in Hitler's aims and opinions. So, Hitler didn't change at all. And so Orwell's wondering, how did we go from defending him to despising him? How do you go from one extreme to the next? Well, it's like your water. That's people for you. People just slosh back and forth. Now, he continues. He says, when one compares his utterances of a year ago or so with those made 15 years earlier, a thing that strikes one is the rigidity of his mind, the way in which the worldview does not develop. It is the fixed vision of a monomaniac and not likely to be much affected by the temporary maneuvers of power politics. Probably in Hitler's own mind, the Russo-German Pact represents no more than an alteration of his timetable. And what he's referring to there is there was this pact that had been made between the Germans and the Russians that they weren't going to attack each other. This was at the start of World War II. They would not attack each other. They would divide up Eastern Europe between each other. I can't say what the pact is actually called. I can't pronounce the word. But in Mein Kampf, the main enemies are said to be the Jews and the communists. So Hitler is going to attack the Russians. He's going to attack the Russians just like he hated the Jews. There's no doubt about it. And yet Hitler made a pact with the Russians. And he decided to focus on Great Britain. So the question is, did he change his mind? And Orwell says not at all. Orwell's pointing out in this review that he's not a man that changes his mind. He doesn't change his mind. He's incapable of change. And so he just simply altered his timetable by a false deal that he wasn't going to honor. Now he says the plan laid down in Mein Kampf was to smash Russia first with the implied intention of smashing England afterwards. Now it's turned out England has to be dealt with first because Russia was the more easily bribed of the two. But Russia's turn will come when England is out of the picture. That, no doubt, is how Hitler sees it. Whether it will turn out that way is, of course, a different question. So here's what I'm reading to you tonight. Orwell is so convinced that Hitler doesn't change his mind that he writes a declaration while there is this pact of non-aggression between Germany and Russia. And he's writing, he's telling everyone, Germany is going to attack Russia. He says that before it happens. On June 22nd, 1941, Germany does invade Russia, just exactly as Hitler had said many years earlier in his book of Mein Kampf. And so that's kind of the good thing about dealing with evil people, is that even though they're difficult to reason with, they are predictable. And so he's just studying this man Hitler. He's studying him by this book, and he realizes he doesn't change his mind. He may pause. He may hit the brakes a little bit, but he's going to go full steam ahead with his plan. Now, he writes, suppose that Hitler's program could be put into effect when he envisages 100 years hence is a continuous state of 250 million Germans with plenty of living room. And he's talking about stretching all the way down through Afghanistan, thereabouts. This is how he describes it. A horrible, brainless empire in which essentially nothing ever happens except the training of young men for war and the endless breeding of fresh cannon fodder. How was it that he was able to put this monstrous vision across? It's a good question. How does Hitler sell the nation on that vision? It's easy to say that at one stage of his career, he was financed by the heavy industrialist who saw in him the man who would smash the socialist and the communist. They would not have backed him, however, if he had not talked a great movement into existence already. Again, the situation in Germany with its 7 million unemployed was obviously favorable for demagogues. But Hitler could not have succeeded against his many rivals if it had not been for the attraction of his own personality, which one can feel even in the clumsy writing of Mein Kampf, which is no doubt overwhelming when one hears his speeches. Now, you can look this up online, what I'm reading to you tonight. You can look this up, the review of Mein Kampf by George Orwell. And it will edit right here. It'll leave out what Orwell's about to say. And you can look it up, the unedited version, or the word was unexpurgated. So you learn a new word, you use it, okay? And here's what they're leaving out, because you would think, well, Orwell wouldn't want his works edited. But he said, quote, I should like to put it on record that I have been able to dislike Hitler. You can see why the fans of Orwell wouldn't want that out there. But he said, ever since he came to power, till then, like nearly everyone, I had been deceived into thinking he did not matter. I had reflected, looking back, that I would certainly kill him if I could get within reach, but that I felt no personal animosity. Now, to be fair, there's things about Hitler that we know now that he didn't know then, but this is a man that's considered to be a literary genius and having great understanding of government and oppression, and he says outright that he couldn't bring himself to dislike one of the worst people in human history, Adolf Hitler. And why is that? Well, he says this. The fact is that there's something deeply appealing about him. One feels it again when one sees his photographs. And I recommend especially the photograph at the beginning of Hearst and Blackett's edition, which shows Hitler in his early brown shirt days. And he describes the picture of Hitler. He says, it's a pathetic dog-like face, the face of a man suffering intolerable wrongs. And that appealed to people. In rather a more manly way, it reproduces the expression of innumerable pictures, even of Christ crucified. There's little doubt that that's how Hitler even sees himself. The initial personal cause of his grievance against the universe can only be guessed at, but at any rate, the grievance is here. He is the martyr. He is the victim. Prometheus chained to the rock, the self-sacrificing hero who fights single-handed against impossible odds. He said that's what was attracting people to Hitler. He was suffering. He was suffering and he was willing to fight. If he were killing a mouse, he would know how to make it seem like he were killing a dragon. One feels, as with Napoleon, that he's fighting against destiny, that he can't win, and yet that somehow he deserves to. The attraction of such a pose is, of course, enormous. Half the films that one sees turns upon this theme. Now, what he's saying is the movies everyone watches. That's the thought. The little guy wins. The little guy overcomes the odds. We call it the underdog story there. He's willing to fight the whole world. He can't win. But Orwell respects the fact that he's willing to fight the world. And here's the final paragraph where he explains the attraction of the German people that they would have felt with Hitler. He says, also he has grasped the falsity of the hedonistic attitude to life. Nearly all Western thought since the last war, certainly all progressive thought, has assumed tacitly that human beings desire nothing beyond ease, security, and the avoidance of pain. In such a view of life, there is no room, for instance, for patriotism and the military virtues. The socialist or pacifist, the socialist who finds his children playing with soldiers is usually upset. But he's never able to think of a substitute for the 10 soldiers. 10 pacifists somehow won't do. Hitler, because in his own joyless mind he feels it with exceptional strength, knows that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and in general common sense. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle. They want self-sacrifice. Not to mention drums, flags, loyalty parades. However, they may be, as economic theories, fascism and Nazism, are psychologically far sounder than any hedonistic conception of life. The same is probably true of Stalin's militarized version of socialism. All three of the great dictators have enhanced their power by imposing intolerable burdens on their people. Whereas socialism, and even capitalism in a more grudging way, have said to people, I offer you a good time. Hitler has said, I offer you struggle, danger, even death. And as a result, a whole nation flings itself at his feet. Perhaps later on they'll get sick of it and change their minds, as at the end of the last war. He's referring to World War I. After a few years of slaughter and starvation, greatest happiness of the greatest number, that's a good slogan. But at this moment, quote, he's quoting, better an end with horror than a horror without end, unquote. That's the winner. He's quoting from Hitler. Now that we're fighting against the man who coined that phrase, we better not underrate its emotional appeal. And he shows there, as I read that, he shows some insight to people. Here's a few of Orwell's points. He speaks of the falsity of life, which was the thought that human beings only want ease, security, and avoidance of pain. He says the view that we only want safety, comfort, short working hours, hygiene, and common sense. And here's what he's saying. He's saying that like watching kids play with toys. And he points out, little boys don't want to play with toy pacifists, right? And even kids today, they don't want some, toy college student studying in a safe place. That doesn't appeal to them. And of course, in my days, we had toy guns. That's encouraged. and some had G.I. Joes and toy soldiers and combat toys of different kinds. Everything was about fighting. So there's this important part of human nature that gets ignored or it gets repressed by certain ideologies. And Hitler understood that because he understood there's a part of us that wants to struggle. There's a part of us that wants to self-sacrifice. Not to mention the part that, wants to belong to something. Wants to be a part of something, to be under that flag together, show appreciation at parades and such. And since that's a part of our nature too, those ideologies that appeal to even us, many of us, more than the hedonistic philosophies of life. Because I think everybody here openly, you would say hedonism is a vain life. And hedonism is just living for pleasure. And if you thought, well, that's all I want, I just want to live for pleasure, I bet when you're 80 years old, you don't want that set on your tombstone. You don't want anybody to stand up at your funeral and say he just lived for his own fun. You don't want that. And that's the point. Now, Orwell mentioned socialism and capitalism. He mentioned them way back then. And how that they have said to people, we offer you a good time, opposed to Hitler who said, I offer you struggle and danger and death. And the climate of their living and politics at that time, he said, caused that nation to fling itself at his feet eventually. Now, the struggle that's taking place in America, in our country, is about socialism and capitalism. And the dispute supposedly is about which economic theory is going to do the most good for the most people. That's the idea. But here's what you need to think about. What if that isn't what the political contention or the real strife is all about? What if that's not what's happening? What if the real result that this nation is falling apart at the seams, what if the real result is that people have got it too good? What if that's the situation? What if we're all just too comfortable and we're still looking for a fight because that's in us? Now, I think it's a valid question. I think it is what's happening in America now. And it has happened in intervals throughout our history, even the history of the world. America, with our Constitution and the blessings of liberty and freedom that we have, that will prove to be the ultimate condemnation for what we are. Just sinful, unstable souls that's unrest within, and therefore there's this fighting and contention without. My point is, there's a whole lot of people complaining today that ought to be grateful. There's a whole lot of people that are willing to burn things down that they ought to honor. And the society is tearing itself up because it's bored with its own vain way of living. And that's sad. The most prosperous, powerful nation I believe the world has ever seen, but think about how this reveals the true problem of man's nature. Because from the start, progress was built into the fabric of our country because you had the people's rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You had the guaranteed freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to protest, freedom to petition the government, freedom to choose our leaders. All that was a recipe for progress. And so you can start off in a society like that that's built that way with all kinds of injustices in that society, all kinds of things that are wrong, as long as you're allowed to call it out, as long as you're allowed to protest, then you got a right to get a voice, and people can hear you, and you can have a following, and then you can demand change, and you can even vote and elect leaders who will affect the change you want. And as long as that's the situation, you're going to have a society where there's going to be constant progress. And in our history, the practice of slavery was changed. In our history, the ability for women to vote was changed. There's been all kinds of sort of things that got changed in just the fashion that I've described. It started with protest, freedom of speech, freedom to protest. But then understand that the more things improve, the more things get better, the less injustices there are. And the less reasons people have to complain are valid. The better things get, the less there is to fight about. But we still want to fight. We still want to fight. It's part of our nature. So what's happened is there's a lot of people that have chosen to fight over lesser things. The most powerful nation on earth is not going to be really threatened by an external threat out there. And so there's a lot of people within that are going to invent internal threats and then magnify those internal problems to where they're the worst things going on the planet. And the nation that once, tore itself apart over state rights versus preserving the Union, now is a nation of people that are fighting over using the wrong gender pronoun. Who wants to fight for that? I wouldn't want to. But you got a lot of folks that want to. The nation that fought against Nazism and the attempt to annihilate the Jewish people, putting them into ovens, now wants to fight over a Christian baker who doesn't want to bake a wedding cake and put that into an oven. If there's not an actual soldier to fight, they go and tear a monument of a soldier down. That's the climate. That's what's going on there. If there's not an actual hate crime to stand against, then people will lie and fabricate one and lie about it, and then they can fight against that one. But whatever happens, people are going to fight because people are people. And James said, from whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence? Even of your lust that war in your members? People are restless by nature. When things are, happening around them, just as if you threw stones into a water, the water, it's not by nature what it is, it ain't just going to stay there. It ain't just going to remain calm. And the ultimate point, the way to apply all this, folks, is to overcome evil that is in us. That tide coming in, those waves going out, foaming up shame, he said. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. And that's the key. Recall Orwell said this, the socialist pacifist can't find a good substitute for the tin soldier. Well, for us tonight, the good substitute is the good fight. If you're not involved in the good fight, you're going to have a problem at home. You're going to have a problem fighting people you shouldn't be fighting. You're going to get into some trouble. You know why? Because you're restless like water. That's our nature. And the fact is that when we're involved in fighting against the enemy, that'll be all the fight we'll be interested in. The Bible says this, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. And the next statement says, whom resist, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world. Now, I thank God for this country, and I thank God for our government. I do. And I'm praying for the people that are in power right now. Like I've said before, I'm afraid not to. But the truth is, again, this isn't home. As an American, I have the right to say what I would protest against. I have a right to speak up. We have the right to vote, and I don't understand Christians that would advocate you shouldn't vote as a Christian. Mordecai got involved in a political issue when he found out they were going to assassinate the king, and the Lord bore witness with that it was the right thing to do. And you and I, if we can make sure justices can be, preserved and we can stand up for what's right just simply by going to the polls, then we ought to do that. But our fight, the real fight, is spiritual. And we wrestle against some unclean things and some unseen things. And we need to take it seriously, because if we don't, we'll get caught up in all kinds of things we're fighting about that is nothing but a distraction. All right, we'll stop right there. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. And like I said when we got started, tonight's going to be a different kind of a message, just some different things I've been studying and listening to and wanted to communicate these things to you. And I don't know if we should even have an invitation tonight. Miss Robin's coming, so I'll let her come. But as we think about getting involved in the good fight, not getting distracted by a bunch of other fighting that's taking on around us over some useless, embarrassing issues even, I would ask you tonight, is there a reason why we should open up this invitation? Is there anybody? Say, yeah, preacher, please. I need to come and pray tonight. I need to come and pray. Anybody? Say, yeah, brother, have an invitation. Anybody? All right, if not, I'm going to ask you to stand, and we're going to be dismissed in prayer. Miss Robin will play afterwards. But Father, we do thank you, Lord, for this time that we have to come together and meet around your word, and we realize